It's 5:29 in the morning on July 16, 1945. In a forgotten corner of the New Mexico desert, known by the Spanish conquistadors as the Jornada del Muerto, humanity holds its breath. Beneath a 30-meter steel tower, a plutonium device, wired like the nervous system of a metallic beast, waits in the darkness. 10,000 meters away, a group of men, physicists, mathematicians, Nobel laureates, lie face down in the damp sand, protected by welding goggles, trembling not from the storm's cold, but from a question no one dares to answer aloud. Will they ignite the atmosphere? Will they stop time? Or simply, will they fail? In a fraction of a second, the sky tore open. It wasn't just an explosion, it was the violent birth of a new era. But what burned in that desert wasn't just science. It was the result of 6 years of paranoia, a secret race against a Nazi ghost that no longer existed, and the largest industrial mobilization in the history of our species. It was the culmination of a primitive fear transformed into divine engineering. This is the complete story of how democracy built the ultimate weapon to save itself from fascism, only to find, at the end of the road, with the power to destroy the entire world in its hands. From the kidnapping of scientists in occupied Europe to the clandestine cities that didn't appear on any map. From the panic over Hitler's reactors to the political inertia that condemned 2 Japanese cities. Welcome to the autopsy of the Manhattan Project. Welcome to the countdown to the end of the world. To understand the horror of 1945, we must go back to the fear of 1938. The apocalypse did not begin in a military bunker in Washington, but at a lab bench in the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin, the heart of the Third Reich's science. On Christmas Eve of that year, the world of classical physics silently collapsed. German chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann had performed a bewildering experiment that defied everything known to date. By bombarding a uranium nucleus with slow neutrons, they expected to get a heavier element, something akin to radium. Instead, they got barium, a much lighter element. They didn't understand it. They had broken matter, but their minds could not accept what their instruments were screaming at them. The explanation did not come from Berlin, but from Sweden, from an exile. Lise Meitner, an Austrian Jewish physicist and former close collaborator of Hahn's, had just barely escaped Nazi Germany, crossing the border with only 10 marks in her pocket and a diamond ring in case she needed to bribe border guards. Meitner received Hahn's letter with the impossible results. While walking through a snowy forest near Gothenburg with her nephew, the physicist Otto Frisch, she sat on a fallen log and began doing calculations on a crumpled piece of paper. She realized that the uranium nucleus hadn't transformed. It had split in half like an unstable drop of water. But the most terrifying part was the mass. The sum of the resulting parts was slightly less than the original nucleus. Where had that lost mass gone? Meitner applied Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared. That minuscule loss of mass had converted into a titanic release of energy, 200 million electron volts for every single atom. Meitner borrowed a term from cell biology to describe the phenomenon: fission. The news spread like wildfire through the global scientific community in early 1939. For the average citizen, it was incomprehensible theoretical physics. But for a small group of Jewish refugee physicists in the United States and Great Britain, the discovery was a death sentence. Men like Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, and Eugene Wigner, who had seen fascism devour their homes in Hungary and Germany, immediately understood the mathematical implication. If you could split one atom, you could release energy. If you could split millions of atoms in a self-sustaining chain reaction, you could unleash hell on Earth. And the man who held the key to that hell, the man who controlled the labs where the discovery was made, was Adolf Hitler. Fear ceased to be a hypothesis in March of 1939. When Nazi Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, one of the first administrative orders from the Reich War Ministry was not military, but industrial. Berlin immediately ordered a halt to all uranium exports from the Joachimsthal mines, the only significant source of uranium in Europe at the time. For Leo Szilard, that was absolute confirmation. The Nazis didn't just know what they had, they were hoarding the fuel to build the bomb. Szilard's nightmare was vivid and constant. He imagined London, Paris, or Washington vaporized by a single Luftwaffe plane while the democracy slept, ignorant of the atomic danger. However, in the United States, the military bureaucracy was deeply skeptical. Generals saw atomic physics as distant science fiction, the dreams of academics disconnected from the reality of the trenches. It was believed that to build an atomic bomb, tons of natural uranium would be needed, a weight no plane could carry. Conventional physics said a bomb was theoretically possible, but logistically infeasible. That's when two refugee scientists in Great Britain, Otto Frisch, Meitner's nephew, and Rudolf Peierls, changed history forever. In March of 1940, working at the University of Birmingham, they drafted a 3-page secret memorandum that would become known as the Frisch-Peierls Memorandum. Their calculations demonstrated a chilling fact. If the rare isotope uranium-235 could be separated from common uranium, tons wouldn't be needed to achieve critical mass. An amount the size of a grapefruit would suffice. Just a few kilograms. That meant the bomb was transportable in a current bomber. The bomb wasn't a dream for the next century, it was possible today. This discovery galvanized the British, who formed the Maud Committee to investigate the weapon's feasibility. While the United States was still at peace and doubtful, Great Britain, under the bombing of the Blitz, understood that this was the only card left for ultimate survival. Simultaneously, British intelligence began detecting alarming movements in occupied Europe that confirmed their worst fears. The Nazis had set their sights on a remote hydroelectric plant in Vemork, in the freezing Telemark region of Norway. The plant, controlled by the Norsk Hydro Company, was the only facility in the world capable of producing heavy water on an industrial scale as a fertilizer byproduct. Heavy water is a vital moderator for controlling nuclear reactors that use natural uranium. Germany ordered the plant to increase heavy water production to 5,000 liters per year, an absurd amount for civilian use. There was no benign reason for such a demand. It was the definitive proof that Werner Heisenberg, the German Nobel laureate and leader of the Nazi Uranium Club, was trying to build a nuclear reactor. And a nuclear reactor produces plutonium, the second path to the bomb. Desperate and without direct access to the high echelons of the US government, the refugee scientists in America decided to play their highest card. They sought out the world's most famous and respected scientist, Albert Einstein. In the summer of 1939, Leo Szilard and Eugene Wigner visited Einstein at his summer home on Long Island. Einstein, a convinced pacifist who had dedicated his life to peace, listened to the arguments about the chain reaction and the possibility of a Nazi bomb. After a moment of silence, he uttered a phrase that would mark his destiny and his eternal remorse. "I had not thought of that." Driven solely by the terror that Hitler would get the weapon first and enslave the world, Einstein signed a letter drafted by Szilard, addressed to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, warning him of extremely powerful bombs of a new type that could destroy entire ports in the surrounding territory. That letter reached the Oval Office in October of 1939, hand-delivered by economist Alexander Sachs. Roosevelt, after hearing the explanation and reading Einstein's warning, summarized the situation with a pragmatic and chilling phrase. "Alex, what you are driving at is that the Nazis must not blow us up." The president authorized the immediate creation of the Uranium Committee. But the initial response was lethargic and disappointing. A ridiculous budget of $6,000 was allocated to buy graphite and uranium oxide for preliminary experiments. The United States was not yet at war, and the bomb seemed a distant problem. They did not know the clock was already ticking, and that across the Atlantic, the Germans were already conducting their first reactor experiments, and that British commandos were already training to die in the snows of Norway, trying to stop them. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 awoke the sleeping giant with an industrial fury. The atomic bomb ceased to be a theoretical university experiment to become a top military necessity. The project moved from scientific to military hands. The United States Army Corps of Engineers took complete control under a new code name, designed to sound boringly bureaucratic and avoid suspicion: the Manhattan Engineer District, or simply the Manhattan Project. In September of 1942, the project needed a leader who could move mountains, not just solve equations. The chosen one was Colonel Leslie Groves, a burly, abrasive, difficult, and extraordinarily efficient man who had just overseen the construction of the Pentagon in record time. Groves accepted the job with reluctance, thinking it was a minor assignment, but his first demand was to be promoted to brigadier general, arguing pragmatically that Nobel-winning scientists would not respect or obey a simple colonel. Groves was a man of action who hated the dreamy academics and their endless debates, but he made a personnel decision that baffled the FBI and military intelligence. He chose jaded Robert Oppenheimer as the project's scientific director. Oppenheimer was a brilliant but temperamental theoretical physicist, a cultured and skeletal man who read Sanskrit and French poetry, smoked compulsively, and had a history of donations to communist causes during the Spanish Civil War. He was, on paper, the worst possible choice to guard the nation's biggest secret. He didn't have a Nobel Prize like many of his colleagues, and he had never managed anything, not even a small university department. But Groves, with a keen instinct, saw in him unbridled ambition and intellectual arrogance that would be necessary to master the scientific egos ahead. Together, the conservative general and the bohemian physicist would form the odd couple that would build the end of the world. Groves's first problem wasn't physics, but raw material. To build the bombs, uranium was needed, lots of uranium, but not just any uranium. US and Canadian mines produced low-grade ore. That's when one of those fortunate accidents that changed history occurred. Groves discovered that a Belgian businessman, Edgar Sengier, director of the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, had anticipated the danger years earlier. Fearing a German invasion of Africa, Sengier had secretly shipped 1,200 tons of high-purity uranium ore from his Shinkolobwe mine in the Belgian Congo to New York. The uranium had been stored in a warehouse on Staten Island, forgotten, waiting for someone to ask for it. When Groves's officers came to him, Sengier simply asked, "When do you want me to ship it?" Without that Congolese uranium, the Manhattan Project would have failed due to lack of material. With the raw materials secured, construction began. The Manhattan Project was not a simple laboratory. It was the creation of a massive parallel industry, a state within a state, hidden under a veil of absolute secrecy that consumed more electricity than entire nations. Groves and Oppenheimer knew that to enrich uranium and produce plutonium, the two possible paths to the bomb, they would need industrial facilities of a magnitude never before seen in human history. In the isolated hills of East Tennessee, the Army expropriated 60,000 acres of land, displacing 3,000 farming families with barely 2 weeks' notice, paying them pennies for their ancestral lands. There, between the mud and the secrecy, they built Oak Ridge, a clandestine city that didn't appear on any official map and that, in a matter of months, would house 75,000 people. Its main purpose was to separate the rare isotope uranium-235 from uranium-238, a physically fiendishly difficult task because both are chemically identical and only differ slightly in weight. To achieve this, they built the Y-12 plant, a cathedral of industry that used gigantic electromagnets called calutrons to separate the atoms magnetically. These magnets required massive amounts of copper for their coils, but copper was a strategic material vital for manufacturing bullet casings and was scarce during wartime. General Groves did something unheard of. He went to the Undersecretary of the United States Treasury and asked to borrow the National Silver Reserve. When the official told him that Treasury silver was measured in troy ounces, Groves replied coolly that he needed it in tons. 14,700 tons of pure silver were delivered to him, valued at more than $300 million at the time, to be melted down and converted into cables and coils. For years, the Y-12 plant operated with the world's most precious metal running through its veins, guarded by armed guards and accountants who had to recover every last shaving at the end of the war. The most surprising thing about Oak Ridge was its workforce. Thousands of young women, fresh out of rural Tennessee high schools, were hired to operate the Calutron control panels. They had no idea what they were doing. They were known as the Calutron girls. They were instructed to keep the meter needles at a specific point by turning dials, monitoring fluctuations they didn't understand. If they asked what they were making, the answer was always the same and threatening. You are helping to shorten the war. If you talk, you are traitors. If they insisted, they were fired and escorted out of the city. Curiously, in an internal competition, these young women without scientific training proved to be more efficient operating the machines than the Berkeley PhD physicists themselves because they weren't trying to adjust the controls based on theories or trying to optimize the process, but were blindly following instructions with mechanical precision. Meanwhile, in the high desert of Washington state, far from any population, they built Hanford, a brutalist industrial complex designed for an alchemical purpose, to transmute uranium into a new artificial element that barely existed in nature, plutonium. The nuclear reactors built there, like the historic Reactor B, were beasts of graphite and uranium that generated so much heat that they had to divert water from the Columbia River to cool them. The project was so massive that the river noticeably heated up as it passed, affecting local wildlife. It was in Hanford where the native Wanapum tribe was expelled from their sacred lands along the river, becoming the first victims of nuclear displacement. And finally, there was the brain of the beast, Los Alamos in New Mexico. Site Y. Oppenheimer chose this location, an isolated plateau at 2,200 meters high, because he remembered riding horses there in his youth and loved its austere beauty. He wanted a place where scientists could concentrate without distractions from the outside world. It became a luxury prison. Hundreds of the planet's brightest minds, Hungarians, Germans, Italians, British, and Americans, were brought there with their families to live in poorly insulated wooden barracks, surrounded by barbed wire, dust, and guards who read their correspondence. Security was paranoid and absolute. The city had no legal address. All the babies born in Los Alamos during the war, dozens of them, had the same strange address on their birth certificate, Post Office Box 1663, Santa Fe, New Mexico. Famous names disappeared from the face of the earth. The Italian Nobel laureate Enrico Fermi, who had achieved the first controlled chain reaction under the stands of a stadium in Chicago, became Mr. Henry Farmer. Niels Bohr, the father of quantum physics, whom the British had to smuggle out of occupied Denmark in the bomb bay of a Mosquito airplane, where he nearly died from lack of oxygen because his mask didn't fit properly, was given the code name Nicholas Baker and assigned a bodyguard with orders to shoot him if he fell into Nazi hands. But even with such security, shadows leaked through. The Soviet Union, though allied in the war against Hitler, was not invited to the atomic project, something Stalin deeply resented. So Stalin activated his spy network. Among the British scientists who arrived at Los Alamos as part of the Allied collaboration, there was a quiet, hard-working man, well-liked by everyone, named Klaus Fuchs. Fuchs was a German refugee, a brilliant physicist, and secretly a convinced communist who believed the bomb should not belong to a single nation. While helping solve the most complex mathematical problems of implosion and designing explosive lenses, Fuchs memorized blueprints, production rates, and critical dimensions. On his days off, he drove to Santa Fe and delivered detailed reports to his Soviet contact, Harry Gold, who sent them to Moscow. Thanks to Fuchs and another young prodigy spy named Theodore Hall, Stalin knew more about the technical progress of the American atomic bomb than the Vice President of the United States himself, Harry Truman. As 1944 progressed, a technical crisis arose at Hanford that threatened to sink the entire project. Reactor B, newly started up, began mysteriously failing. The chain reaction would start, reach power, and then inexplicably die, like a stalled engine. The scientists were bewildered and terrified. If the reactors didn't work, there would be no plutonium. There would be no bomb. It was the genius of Enrico Fermi and John Wheeler that solved the enigma in a night of frantic sleeplessness. They discovered that the reactor was producing an unexpected point as a byproduct of fission, Xenon 135. This gas acted as a neutron poison, absorbing them and stopping the chain reaction. The original reactor design did not have enough fuel capacity to overcome this poisoning. Fortunately, DuPont engineers, distrustful of the theoretical physicists' calculations, had oversized the reactor, leaving room to add more uranium rods, just in case. That engineering precaution saved the plutonium program. They added more fuel, overcame the xenon poisoning, and production continued. But the plutonium crisis wasn't over. In the summer of 1944, the first sample of reactor-produced plutonium arrived at Los Alamos. Physicist Emilio Segre analyzed it and discovered something devastating. The reactor plutonium had a fatal impurity, the isotope plutonium-240. It was so unstable that it emitted neutrons spontaneously at an extremely high rate. This meant that the original bomb design, called Thin Man, which used the simple gun method to slam two pieces of material together, was useless for plutonium. The plutonium bullet would melt before hitting the target due to background radiation. The bomb would fizzle, reacting prematurely and releasing only a dirty, weak explosion, not an atomic one. The Thin Man design was scrapped. Panic seized Los Alamos. Oppenheimer was close to resigning, believing they had failed. Billions of dollars invested at Hanford seemed worthless. It was then that the Hungarian mathematician John von Neumann and the Ukrainian explosives expert George Kistiakowsky proposed a radical idea, theoretically possible but fiendishly difficult to execute: implosion. Instead of slamming pieces together, they would have to surround a sphere of subcritical plutonium with high-power conventional explosives and detonate them all simultaneously inward. These explosives would have to create a perfectly spherical and symmetrical shockwave that compressed the plutonium core, increasing its density until it reached critical mass in a millionth of a second. It was like trying to squeeze an orange with explosives from all sides without breaking the peel, only instantly reducing its size. It was a challenge of engineering and precision never before attempted. Thus was born the design of Fat Man. But no one, absolutely no one, knew if it would work in reality. It was a blind gamble. In late 1944, while scientists at Los Alamos struggled against the laws of physics and geometry to save the plutonium bomb, Allied armies were already stepping onto European soil. Behind the combat lines, advancing with the vanguard of the troops, moved an unprecedented scientific intelligence unit. Its code name was Alsos Mission. Its military leader was the intrepid Colonel Boris Pasch, an anti-communist veteran, and its scientific leader, the Dutch physicist Samuel Goudsmit. Their objective was not territory, nor bridges, nor cities. Their mission was to capture people and papers. They had to find Werner Heisenberg and uncover the truth that had tormented the Allies for 5 years. How close was Hitler to having the bomb? For 5 years, the fear of the German bomb had justified every dollar, every expropriation, and every moral sacrifice of the Manhattan Project. It was assumed that the Germans, having discovered fission, were years ahead. But as the Alsos mission captured laboratories at the University of Strasbourg and advanced into southern Germany, the image of terror began to crumble. They found disorganized lab notes, raw, poorly processed pieces of uranium, and confused scientists who were surprised to see them. There was no sign of a massive industry. In April of 1945, in the final days of the Reich, Alsos agents reached a small, picturesque town in the Black Forest called Haigerloch. There, hidden in a cave that had served as a beer cellar beneath the castle church, they found the holy grail of the Nazi nuclear program. It was not a kilometer-long industrial factory like Oak Ridge's K-25. There were no giant reactors like those at Hanford. What they found was pathetic compared to their nightmares: an unfinished experimental reactor, the B-8. It consisted of simple uranium cubes hanging from chains like a macabre chandelier, designed to be submerged in a heavy water tank. The truth hit the Allies with the force of a revelation. Germany had failed miserably. Their calculations about critical mass were wrong. They had bet on heavy water instead of graphite, a fatal error. They lacked the industrial resources, and most importantly, Hitler, obsessed with quick revenge weapons like the V-2 rockets, had never given real priority or unlimited funding to the atomic project. Heisenberg had been working painstakingly on a reactor to generate energy, not even a bomb. The United States had been running a life-or-death race, exhausting its resources and morale, against a runner who hadn't even shown up at the starting line. To confirm this definitively, the British carried out a masterful intelligence operation called Operation Epsilon. They interned 10 top captured German scientists, including Heisenberg, Otto Hahn, and Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker in an elegant country house called Farm Hall near Cambridge, England. The house was filled with hidden microphones in the lamps, under the tables, and in the rooms. For 6 months, the British listened to their private conversations. The Farm Hall transcripts revealed that when they heard the news of the American atomic bomb on Hiroshima months later, their first reaction was total disbelief. Heisenberg told Hahn it was a lie, that the Americans must have dropped tons of conventional explosives and called it atomic for propaganda. They couldn't believe that the American amateurs had achieved what they, the German physics elite, considered impossible for the next decade. With the discovery of Alsos and the unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany in May of 1945, the original moral justification for the Manhattan Project instantly evaporated. The bomb was conceived solely and exclusively as a defense against Hitler. Without Hitler, and with Japan incapable of developing such technology, the motive for building the doomsday weapon ceased to exist. However, the machinery did not stop. It didn't even slow down. This is where the history of science turns into the dark history of political and bureaucratic inertia. By the spring of 1945, the Manhattan Project had taken on a life of its own. The government had spent $2 billion of the time, equivalent to tens of billions today. General Groves understood the political dynamics better than anyone. If the war ended without the bomb being used, and the public discovered that this fortune had been spent in secret for nothing, Congress would launch a massive investigation that would end political and military careers. How would they justify to taxpayers the construction of secret cities and the diversion of vital resources to create a weapon that remained on a shelf, gathering dust? The bomb needed to be used to justify its own financial existence. Furthermore, the morality of air warfare had drastically changed during the conflict. In the early stages, the bombing of civilians was condemned, but by 1945, total destruction had become normalized. On the night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, the U.S. Air Force, under the command of the relentless General Curtis LeMay, launched Operation Meeting House, the incendiary bombing of Tokyo. In a single night, 300 B-29 bombers dropped 1,600 tons of M69 napalm cluster bombs on the Japanese capital, which was mostly built of wood. The resulting firestorm boiled the city's canals and killed 100,000 people, men, women, and children, in 6 hours, more immediate deaths than the future Hiroshima explosion would cause. The moral line on killing civilians on an industrial scale had already been crossed long before the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb only promised to do it more efficiently, a single plane instead of 300. The geopolitical scenario was also rapidly transforming. With Germany defeated, the fragile alliance of convenience with the Soviet Union began to crack. Strategists in Washington, including future Secretary of State James Burns, began to see the bomb not only as a way to end the war in the Pacific, but as a crucial diplomatic tool to contain Stalin in the post-war era. If the United States possessed the ultimate weapon and demonstrated the willingness to use it, it could dictate the terms of the New World Order and curb Soviet advances in Europe and Asia. The bomb ceased to be a weapon of war and became a political chess piece. On April 12th, the political universe of the United States was shaken. President Roosevelt died of a cerebral hemorrhage. Harry S. Truman, his vice president, was sworn in. Truman was an honest man from Missouri, but until that day, he had been kept in total ignorance about the war's secrets. Roosevelt had never told him about the bomb. In their first meeting after he took office, Secretary of War Henry Stimson gravely revealed the secret to him. "Mr. President, in 4 months, we will have a weapon capable of destroying an entire city." Truman, overwhelmed by the sudden responsibility, did not question the process. He boarded a train that was already moving at full speed and had no brakes. However, in the laboratories of Chicago and Los Alamos, some scientists began to wake up from their technical trance upon seeing that Germany had fallen. Leo Szilard, the same man who had urged Einstein to write the initial letter out of fear of the Nazis, now understood the horror of what was coming. Szilard desperately tried to reach Truman to stop the use of the bomb, but was blocked by Burns. In June of 1945, a group of Chicago scientists, led by Nobel laureate James Franck, drafted a secret document known as the Franck Report. It was an act of moral courage. The report prophetically warned that using the bomb against Japan without warning would destroy international trust and trigger a nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union that would endanger the future of humanity. They suggested an alternative, a technical demonstration of the bomb on a deserted island or over an uninhabited forest, before observers from the United Nations and Japan to force surrender through intimidation without massacre. But the report fell on deaf ears. It was referred to the Interim Committee, a secret group of high-level politicians and military officials convened to advise Truman. The committee, dominated by Burns and Groves, rejected the idea of a demonstration. Their arguments were cold and pragmatic. What if the bomb failed during the demonstration? It would be a humiliation that would strengthen Japanese morale. What if the Japanese moved American prisoners of war into the test area? Furthermore, they only had 2 bombs ready. They couldn't waste one on fireworks. The final decision was unanimous and chilling. The bomb should be used against a military target surrounded by workers' homes to show its total destructive power, and it should be used without prior warning to maximize psychological impact and shock. Inertia had won the moral battle. The bomb, born of the legitimate fear of Nazi enslavement, was now prepared to fall on a nation that was already militarily defeated, with its navy sunk, its skies defenseless, and its cities burned, but which, trapped in its own code of honor and seeking a negotiated surrender that preserved its emperor, refused unconditional capitulation. The target had changed from Berlin to Hiroshima, but the weapon remained the same, and the will to use it was now unstoppable. The New Mexico desert is a place of austere and violent beauty, a landscape of white sand and dry scrub under a relentless sun. In a desolate stretch known as the Jornada del Muerto, the Army marked off an exclusion zone. There, in the summer of 1945, the stage was set for the most dangerous experiment in human history. The code name for the test, chosen by Oppenheimer and inspired by a poem by John Donne, was Trinity. The pressure on Los Alamos was suffocating. The design of the uranium bomb, Little Boy, was so simple that scientists were confident it would work without needing a test. But the plutonium bomb, Fat Man, was a completely different beast. It relied on implosion, a perfect sphere of conventional explosives that had to detonate with microsecond symmetry to compress the plutonium core. If it failed, it would be the most expensive fiasco of the war. The plutonium would scatter across the desert, turning the area into a toxic wasteland without producing an atomic explosion. They had to test it. On July 12th, the components of the gadget, as they called the test bomb, arrived at the McDonald Ranch, an abandoned adobe house inside the Trinity perimeter. In what had been the farm's master bedroom, the assembly team, wearing white gloves and holding their breath, mounted the nuclear heart of the device. It was a surreal scene, the most advanced technology of the 20th century being assembled in a dusty shack with windows sealed with adhesive tape to keep the sand out. The final gadget did not look like a weapon. It was a monstrous sphere of metal, covered in wires and detonators that made it look like a huge cybernetic organism. It was slowly hoisted to the top of a 30-meter steel tower. There it hung suspended, swaying gently in the desert wind, awaiting its moment. The test date was set for the early morning of July 16th. Truman was already in Potsdam, Germany, waiting to meet with Stalin and Churchill. He needed to know if he had the bomb in his pocket before sitting down to negotiate. Groves's message to Oppenheimer was clear. Success was mandatory, but nature had other plans. On the night of July 15th, a violent electrical storm swept the desert. Lightning struck near the steel tower where the atomic bomb rested. Panic seized the base camp. If lightning hit the tower and detonated the conventional explosives, the plutonium would scatter, killing everyone present with radiation. Oppenheimer, chain-smoking cigarettes, was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. General Groves, trying to maintain composure, slept fitfully in his tent as the rain beat down on the canvas. At 4 in the morning, the rain eased. Meteorologists gave a window of opportunity. The countdown began for 5:30. In the observation bunkers, located 10,000 yards from ground zero, scientists smeared sun cream on their faces and put on dark welding goggles. The atmosphere was a mix of terror and black humor. Enrico Fermi, the Italian genius, began taking bets among his colleagues on whether the explosion would ignite the atmosphere and destroy the entire planet. Although calculations said the probability was almost zero, in that moment of absolute tension, the almost weighed heavily. No one truly knew what was going to happen. They were about to unleash forces that hadn't been seen in the universe since the creation of the stars. At 5:29 minutes and 45 seconds, the voice over the loudspeaker reached zero. In that instant, there was no sound, only light. A light that was not of this world. A white, violet, and gold flash that erased shadows, penetrated closed eyelids, and illuminated the surrounding mountains with an intensity 20 times greater than midday. It was as if the sun had descended to Earth. A blind photographer who was there said he felt the heat of the light in his empty sockets. The silence lasted an eternity. And then, the sound arrived. A deep, visceral roar that struck the observers like a physical hammer, followed by an endless thunder that rolled through the valley for minutes. At ground zero, the 30-meter steel tower simply ceased to exist. It vaporized instantly. The desert sand melted, turning into a jade-green radioactive glass that they would later call trinitite. A multicolored fireball expanded, boiling and writhing, before ascending into a majestic and terrifying column that pierced the clouds and formed the first atomic mushroom cloud in history. In the control bunker, the initial reaction was one of pure relief. It worked. Physicist Isidore Rabi looked around and saw that, after the initial euphoria, a cold silence descended upon the men. Kenneth Bainbridge, the test director, turned to Oppenheimer and whispered a phrase that captured the brutal reality of the moment. "Now we are all sons of bitches." Oppenheimer, his face illuminated by the residual glow and his eyes fixed on the cloud rising into the stratosphere, recalled a verse from the Hindu scriptures, the Bhagavad Gita. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." The success of Trinity was absolute. The power of the explosion exceeded all expectations. It was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. The encrypted telegram was immediately sent to Potsdam for President Truman. The baby is born well. It was no longer theory. It was no longer equations on a blackboard. The United States held the power of a Kirin in its hands. And on the other side of the world, the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, unaware of what had just happened in an American desert, continued their poies, not knowing that their death sentence had just been signed with fire and green glass. Science had triumphed. Now the human tragedy began. While the radioactive sand of New Mexico was still cooling, a different race was coming to an end in the Pacific. The heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis had arrived at Tinian Island on July 26th after a high-speed, top-secret voyage. Its cargo was not gold or troops, but a lead cube containing the result of years of effort at Oak Ridge, half of the world's reserve of enriched uranium-235. The delivery was successful, but tragedy struck immediately after. 4 days later, while sailing toward the Philippines, the Indianapolis was torpedoed by a Japanese submarine. Of the 1,196 crew members, 900 fell into the water. For 4 days of unimaginable terror, the men were devoured by sharks and succumbed to madness and thirst under the Pacific sun. No one knew they were there because their mission had been so secret that their route was not reported. It was the first blood sacrifice of the atomic age, a maritime tragedy silenced by the imminence of the apocalypse that they themselves had transported. On Tinian, engineers assembled the bomb. They called it Little Boy. Unlike Fat Man or the Trinity device, this bomb was thin, elongated, and deceptively simple. Its design was a gun mechanism. A conventional explosive would fire a hollow uranium bullet onto a solid uranium target. Upon impact, they would form the critical mass. Here lies the most chilling fact of the entire history of the Manhattan Project. This bomb, the weapon that was going to be used on a living city, had never been tested. The scientists were so certain of the uranium mathematics, and the material was so scarce and expensive to produce, that they decided not to spend it on a test. The attack on Hiroshima was not just a military operation. It was the largest-scale scientific experiment in history, conducted directly on human beings. They were going to drop a physical theory on a civilian population, blindly trusting that the blackboard calculations from Los Alamos were correct. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay took off from Tinian. Colonel Paul Tibbets carried 4 tons of death in his bomb bay. The primary target was Hiroshima, a port city that until then had been inexplicably spared from conventional incendiary bombings. Now the reason was known. It had been preserved intact to precisely measure the damage of the new weapon. At 8:15 in the morning, the city of Hiroshima was waking up. It was a hot, clear morning. Workers were heading to factories. Children, mobilized to clear debris for fire breaks, were in the streets. Women were preparing breakfast. Japanese radar detected 3 enemy planes, but as there were so few, no mass air raid alarm was sounded. People looked up, curious about the drone of the engines. At 30,000 feet, the Enola Gay dropped its payload. The bomb took 43 seconds to fall. 600 meters above the Shima Surgical Hospital, theory became reality. Little Boy detonated. There was no ground impact. The explosion occurred in the air to maximize the blast wave. In a millionth of a second, the heart of the explosion reached a temperature higher than the sun's core. People near the hypocenter did not die. They were instantly carbonized, leaving only their shadows imprinted on the pavement like photographic negatives of eternal horror. Birds ignited in mid-flight. Steel melted. The entire city, built mostly of wood and paper, ceased to exist. The shock wave, traveling at the speed of sound, leveled everything within a 2-kilometer radius. Then came the fire. An inferno consumed what remained. In Washington, 16 hours later, President Truman announced to the world what they had just done.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped 1 bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development. It is an atomic bomb. It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe. The force from which the sun draws its power has been loosed against those who brought war to the Far East. We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history, and we have won. But the greatest marvel is not the size of the enterprise, its secrecy, or its cost, but the achievement of scientific brains in making it work. And hardly less marvelous has been the capacity of industry to design and of labor to operate the machines and methods to do things never done before. Both science and industry work together under the direction of the United States Army, which achieved a unique success in an amazingly short time. It is doubtful if such another combination could be got together in the world. What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
But in Tokyo, the silence was total. Telegraph operators could not contact Hiroshima. Reports were confusing. They couldn't believe that a single bomb had erased an entire metropolis. They sent a reconnaissance plane. The pilot, 160 kilometers away, saw a monstrous cloud still rising over the dead city. The uranium experiment had been an absolute success. Inertia had collected its first great debt. If Hiroshima was a calculated tragedy, Nagasaki was a bureaucratic horror. After the destruction of Hiroshima on August 6th, the Japanese Empire was in a catatonic state of shock. The Supreme War Council was paralyzed, debating whether to surrender or fight until national extinction. but they did not have time to process the grief. On August 8th, the Soviet Union, fulfilling its promise to the Allies, declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria with an overwhelming force of 1.5 million soldiers. For the Japanese leaders, this was as terrifying as the atomic bomb. They were being crushed by two superpowers simultaneously. On Tinian, the machinery of the Manhattan Project did not wait. They had a second bomb ready, and inertia demanded that it be used. This time it was Fat Man, the plutonium implosion bomb, the twin sister of the one that had exploded at Trinity. It was a more complex, more powerful, and more efficient design, and the military wanted to demonstrate to the world, and especially to Stalin, that the United States did not just have one experimental bomb, but a production line of mass destruction. The original date for the second attack was August 11th, but it was moved up to the 9th due to poor weather forecasts. The haste was evident. The mission was chaos from the start. The bomber Boxcar took off with problems in its fuel bomb. Upon reaching the rendezvous point, it wasted valuable time searching for its escort. The primary target was not Nagasaki, it was the city of Kokura, a vital military arsenal. But when the Boxcar reached Kokura, it found the city covered in smoke and clouds. They made 3 passes, but orders were strict. Visual bombing, not radar. With fuel running low and Japanese anti-aircraft defenses waking up, the pilot decided to abort and head for the secondary target. Nagasaki. The fate of an entire city was decided by the weather. Nagasaki was not an ideal military target. It was situated in a valley that would limit the effect of the explosion. But it was on the list. At 11:02 in the morning on August 9th, the clouds over Nagasaki briefly parted. It was enough. Fat Man fell. The explosion was more powerful than Hiroshima's, equivalent to 21,000 tons of TNT, but due to the valley's geography, the destruction was concentrated. Even so, 40,000 people died instantly. Another 40,000 would die in the following days and weeks from burns and radiation. It was the final blow, a bomb created out of fear of the Nazis, a marvel of engineering funded by a democracy, had ended up falling on a secondary Japanese city due to cloud cover, killing a population composed largely of Japanese Christians, Korean forced laborers, and Allied prisoners of war. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice was heard over the radio for the first time in Japanese history. In a speech full of euphemisms, he accepted the inevitable. The enemy has begun to employ a new and supremely cruel bomb, whose power to do damage is indeed incalculable. The war was over, but the shadow of the Manhattan Project was only just beginning to spread. At Los Alamos, the euphoria of victory quickly transformed into a moral hangover. Robert Oppenheimer, the man who had directed the orchestra, found himself tormented by visions of what he had unleashed. Months later, in a meeting with President Truman in the Oval Office, Oppenheimer told him in a trembling voice, "Mr. President, I feel I have blood on my hands." Truman, disgusted by what he considered weakness in a moment of triumph, pulled a handkerchief from his pocket and offered it to him, saying, "Shaw, well, clean yourself up." When Oppenheimer left, Truman told his aide, "I don't want to see that son of a bitch in my office again." The age of scientists was over. The age of generals and politicians had begun. The inertia of death, started with a letter from Einstein out of fear of Hitler, had led us to the edge of an abyss from which we have never been able to retreat. We had stolen fire from the gods, and now we would have to live forever with the fear of burning ourselves.